All right, I wanted to make a quick video about 10 things you can do to improve your Canon R5's low light performance. These are tips and tricks that I use myself, and this has a 45 megapixel sensor, which is immense, but there's sacrifice of a couple stops worth of light compared to the R6 or R3. So these are things I do. Number one is increase your exposure time and decrease your shutter speed. Obviously, that comes at a trade-off of potential motion blur. But obviously what it does is it allows as the sensor to be exposed to light for a longer period of time. And number two, what you can do is increase your aperture size and choose lenses accordingly that have larger aperture diameters. Usually that comes at a consequence of an increased cost. However, keep in mind, the reason I mentioned increasing your aperture size down to 1.2, 1.4, 2.8, instead of shooting at 5.6, 8, 11, or higher. The reason I wanted to mention that as number two is because you can choose lenses accordingly. As I mentioned, the consequence of lenses with larger aperture sizes is the price. But giving you an example of this the RF 700 to 200, this is an EF 700 to 200, and the RF is much more pricey at the aperture 2.8. So what you can do is you can always pick up the old EF L lenses, use them with a adapter, which worked pretty much seamlessly with the RF mount bodies, and you won't have to spend nearly as much as you would on a native RF 70 to 200 2.8 lens compared to buying the EF 70 to 200 versus the RF 70 to 200 f4. I would much rather take the 2.8 L lens from the EF mount. That's personal preference. Your uses may be different, but that's one trick to keep up your sleeve is if you're finding the native RF mount lenses with the large aperture size being very expensive, don't ignore the EF mounts. Those are still fantastic lenses, excellent image quality, work seamlessly with the RF mount, and you don't have to necessarily break the bank for those native RF mounts to get this to near similar performance. Number three is definitely increase your ISO. That's going to introduce noise. That's the trade-off. Beyond 10,000 ISO, I think that's where the R5 starts to see its limitations with noise. Number four, shoot raw. That goes without saying. That kind of ties into number three. If you're increasing your ISO, you definitely want to shoot raw because one, you can resolve the shadows in post, and that goes into point number five, is you can denoise. So point number five is use post-production software like DOX or something else to do noise reduction or removal. And that's going to be far powerful than using the JPEG output from the R5. You can get pretty impressive results and get good image detail and quality because of this 45 megapixel sensor. Number six is definitely take advantage of the IBIS. Take advantage of IBIS and image stabilization on lenses if they have them. Both these lenses have them. The IBIS and image stabilization is fantastic. It allows you to resolve, I think, up to like 5 stops worth of light that you wouldn't be able to, handhold otherwise, and that's pretty helpful. That won't help if your subject is moving really fast, but at least it takes some of your shake out of there. Number 7 is make sure the crop mode is off. This has a 1.6 crop mode on it, and if you're shooting that way, I've heard people accidentally leaving that on, so just make sure that's off, because if you're shooting at 1.6, you're unnecessarily introducing shake because you're zoomed in further than you may need to may have to be. Number 8, use a flash. That's pretty self-explanatory. Number 9, use reflective light, one of those pop-up things, if allowable, reflecting ambient light onto your subject. That may not always be an option. Number 10, use a tripod. It removes all of the shake out of the user, but that's obviously not going to help if your subject's moving quickly. And 10, which is bonus, I do this, is use a breathing technique. If you're able to really take a shot with your subject not being too skittish or moving quickly, take the shot on the exhale or try to hold your breath or exhale very slowly. That's actually allowed me to get maybe a lot of shake out of my picture. Sounds interesting, but I've tried everything. And then now to bring to the last point of discussion is between the R6, R5, and R3, the R5 has a monster sensor. It has a 45 megapixel sensor where you can really crop in and pull details out of pictures. Now that comes at a trade-off of 1 to 3 stops of low light performance. So the R6 has a 20.1 megapixel sensor, and the R6 Mark II has a 24.2 megapixel sensor, and the R3 has a 24 megapixel sensor. That all those sensors, obviously, because of the decreased resolution, allows larger diodes and allows a sensor to be more sensitive to light, and so they'll have higher ISO performance, possibly better dynamic range. However, the 45 megapixel on the R5, for as large of a resolution it is, I believe it only loses 1 to 2 stops worth of light. And so comparing that to historic cameras, I used to shoot film with the Canon AE program. So I used to shoot the 60D crop sensor, and then I shot with the 6D Mark II. And honestly, compared to all those, I feel like this still has pretty good low light performance. And I don't know if that's because of the IBIS coupled with that allows me to really use a lower shutter speed, but I've been pretty happy with that relative to what I've used in the past. So to put things in perspective, I mean, I used to shoot 18 megapixel 60D on a crop sensor. I'm getting amazing low light performance on a full frame sensor of a 45 megapixel camera. So I think one thing to do, all the tips and tricks are helpful, but also to keep in mind where we were relative to where we are now. I mean, technology has come fantastically far, and I think the performance in here is really, really, really good. Now, for what would I love to see for R5 Mark II? In the R5 Mark II, I hope they have a sensor that's 40 megapixels or more. I hope that it's a back illuminated sensor that's stacked with the global shutter. I think that would be I think we would be nearing sensor technology perfection at that point. Of course, this is an opinion. I think we're pretty close to there in terms of glass. We're not quite all the way there in terms of sensor technology, but I think in terms of glass and some of the new RF lenses, including fluorine glass, I'm very much into binoculars, and I like high quality optics, and just seeing the level of chromatic aberration, the neutral colors, the sharpness out of some of the newest RF lenses, and the EFs were absolutely no slouch either. I think we're nearing optical perfection in terms of the glass. And I think when we get to a 40 plus or 50 megapixel sensor that's back illuminated, stacked with a global shutter, I think beyond that, it's always going to be the user's capabilities. I think the glass and the technology has completely gotten out of the way and given everyone close to mature technology in terms of sensor as well as perfection in glass. And so I think that we're in a very in a golden age of technology in terms of cameras. And I think the Canon, I'm really excited to see what the Canon R5 Mark II offers. And lastly, one last thing I wanted to make mention of is I keep so many more of my shots because of the autofocus system in these mirrorless bodies. I think it's amazing. The autofocus is spot on. I've never tried the Canon R6 Mark II's autofocus, but I heard that's even better than the R5, which to me is mind-blowing because of how good the R5's autofocus system already is. Maybe I'm comparing it to old, DSLRs like the 6D Mark II and the 6DD. So, but this is just a world of a jump in relation to those. And so to me, who used to shoot on film before, I feel like we're nearing close to perfection for sure in glass, and even close to fully mature technology and sensors. I hope to be proven wrong, and I hope there's a lot more developments. But as far as I see it, there's very, very, very little limitation in terms of gear available to even the prosumer or general consumer. So thanks for watching. I hope these 10 tips and tricks to improve low light performance helped, and just to add a little bit of perspective at the end of what I hope to see in the future and how this stacks up to the other R cameras in Canon's lineup. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.